Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
We're back for another exciting Conversations.
Yes.
And this time we're here to talk about dragons.
That makes it exciting.
Yes, many people's favorite topic, dragons. Now, we've discussed dragons several times before. They have come up because we've been doing a grand tour of world mythology, and many different cultures have dragon myths. And so we've discussed dragons in several different aspects, but I want to put everything I've thought and researched about dragons all into one episode. So as my grand unified field theory of dragons.
I think it's a very deserving topic.
Well, we'll see what I come up with here.
Yeah.
First of all, virtually every culture on Earth does have a dragon myth, but that depends on how you define dragon. Now, for instance, Egypt has Apophis, the monster that wants to devour the sun. The Aztecs have Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent. The Norse have Jormungand, the giant world serpent that's responsible for Thor's death when Ragnarok comes. The Greeks had several different dragon-like creatures, Typhon and Hydra being the most obvious. China has many different dragons that I've discussed when I did the Monkey King story. However, you may notice not all of those sound like traditional dragons.
Okay.
Some of them are called dragons when they're translated. Quetzalcoatl is a winged serpent. It's a snake with wings and feathers. Apophis is a giant snake that wants to devour the sun. He chases Ra the sun across the sky every day. And Jormungand is literally a giant snake. So, are these dragons? Let me ask you, how do you define a dragon? This is not a trick question because there is no answer to it.
Well, you said it's not traditional, but tradition would simply be based on one's version of tradition.
Right.
So
When you hear the word dragon, do you have an image in your mind?
Oh, well, I mean, any of the characteristics you just mentioned, I would think of as a dragon. I would identify as dragon.
Do you think a dragon has 2 legs or 4?
I think it could have either.
All right, those are very good answers. You think it should have wings?
I do think it would have wings.
Yes, because Asian dragons fly but never have wings. They sort of levitate.
That's interesting.
They can all fly, but they'd have no wings.
Huh. I would have thought wings. But if you can
Yeah.
fly without wings, I
Yeah.
suppose that counts.
And so do you think a dragon has to have legs, since many of the creatures I described were basically snake-like creatures?
So not necessarily.
Yes. You've already hit upon one of my themes, that the definition of dragon, although most of us have a vivid image of a dragon in our mind, the actual definition of dragon from a folklore standpoint is pretty much wide open.
I could say, if it doesn't breathe fire, I would be rather disappointed.
That's interesting because that's a relatively late addition to dragons.
Okay.
It is a very important part of dragons. So the word dragon comes to us from the ancient Greek drakonta, which means serpent or snake.
Okay.
So the word dragon literally means snakes. You can't discuss dragons without talking about snakes and dinosaurs. Now, some people say that the reason why every culture on Earth has a myth about dragons is that they're a memory of a time when there really were creatures like that roaming the world.
Okay.
I don't think that's actually true, not literally true. There were creatures like that roaming the world, but the human race hadn't evolved yet at that point. We're talking about dinosaurs.
Okay.
I believe that people found fossils and tried to imagine what kind of creatures they could be. And then they imagined those into creatures like dinosaurs. You can imagine just finding a big dinosaur bone.
That's a very unified imagination, globally speaking.
Yes, well, there's also, because snakes tie into this too. This is where this might be my first layer that I'm going to.
Okay.
I think that the dinosaurs, the finding bones, and we know people have been finding bones since ancient times.
Right.
There are people in ancient Rome that had fossil collections. They just didn't have any idea what they were.
Yep.
In ancient China, they were finding these that they instantly called dragon bones. Some people say that they called them dragon bones because they already had the myth. I think it's the other way around. I think even more primitive people found the bones and made myths around the bones. Unfortunately, dragon bones are a popular ingredient in Chinese folk medicine, so over the years, countless thousands of irreplaceable fossils have been ground up and fed to people for various cures.
I remember my history teacher in 8th grade saying that something about aspirin having ground up mummified qualities.
I don't know. That's a new one on me.
But to reiterate what you just said.
Yes.
So one more time.
Yes. I think the finding of fossils from ancient times convinced people that there were these giant things that lived on the earth. And so they made up myths about these giant creatures that eventually evolved into the dragon myths that we have today.
Okay.
Because the fossils that they found, they combined with the mythology surrounding snakes. Mm-hmm. Snakes have always been magical. When you think about it, they're just not natural. My wife and I were going on a hike in the woods the other day, and there's a snake in the trail in front of us. And it startled both of us. So, like, as human beings have done for thousands of years, we froze and stared at the snake. It was a totally harmless snake. But he, shot along the ground with that zigzag pattern as snakes have done since time immemorial. And I knew he was moving by undulating his muscles. Mm-hmm. But it didn't look that way. It looked like he wasn't even touching the ground, that he was flying. If you told me he was actually floating a half inch above the ground, I would have totally bought that.
Well, some do.
Yeah, some pretty much do. Snakes are amazing animals. Their methods of locomotion seem quite extraordinary and magical. Human beings have a long relationship with snakes. I think snakes became magical creatures in virtually every culture because they are so obviously different. There's nothing else like them. And there's also a double-edged sword involving snakes, in that snakes can be very beneficial. Snakes eat mice and rats. Mm-hmm. So you want a snake in your fields, you want a snake in your granary, but some snakes can also bite you and kill you, mm-hmm. which is why you should have cats instead. But that's just my opinion. So people have always lived with snakes, and they've always thought there was something special about them. So as mythologies formed over the years, if you wanted a monster, you turned to a monster snake. So how do you make a snake into a monster from a mythological standpoint? Imagine a snake that's big, a snake that can eat you the same way it eats a mouse. So imagine a giant snake. And then you make it even more magical, saying, what if it could fly too?
Well, however,
yeah.
but that wasn't magical because the Titanoboa actually was massive.
Oh yes, there are many huge snakes in the world.
So I'm leaning back towards the reality of them.
Yeah, many of the people had myths about giant snakes who didn't live in a place where there were giant snakes, though. So I think they're taking what was seen as magical about the snake and exemplifying that into a broader thing. They're projecting that into a mythological world. So they imagine giant snakes and they imagine flying snakes.
Could stories so in the same way that these myths traveled the globe, stories about the snakes that do exist could have also traveled?
Oh, yes. People carried their stories with them everywhere they went. And there's still some fuzziness as to how many ancient people had contact with each other.
Okay.
So if you're talking about magical snakes, and you're imagining them in your head, making them more and more mysterious. Mm-hmm. If they're flying, they have to have wings. So you have a winged serpent right there. And then imagine that they have other animal characteristics too. From ancient Greece, we get the concept of the chimera. A chimera is a creature that has the aspects of different animals in one. So they combine different aspects of animals. Like, for instance, the Mushusu from ancient Babylon was a creature that had scales like a snake, and its front feet were those of a lion, and its rear feet were those of a bird.
Right.
And several prime examples from ancient times still exist.
Mm-hmm.
There was one that when it was discovered is referred to as the lion gate, just because of the obvious creature that was on it. Today we call it the Ishtar gate, in honor of the goddess that it was actually built for. So taking snake-like characteristics and using the snake as the basis and basically sticking on other animal attributes. If you think about Oriental dragons, mm-hmm. they are very distinctive from Western dragons, like nothing like them.
Right.
The Oriental dragons have heads that resemble horses somewhat, or in some instances camels. They have the very distinctive nostrils of camels, some of them do. They also have deer antlers, Asian deer antlers, and they have long whiskers like a catfish, which you only find in the Asian dragons, and a long sinuous body, which could look like a snake, or you could say it looks like an eel too. So basically we've got a magical creature inspired by the snake that's already suddenly not a snake anymore, it's a dragon. Inspired by the sight of dinosaur bones.
Possibility.
I think it's a possibility. And once mythology exists, it's never, concrete, of course. Everything changes and evolves over time. You mentioned breathing fire. Now, so far as we know, no dragon breathed fire till around 700 AD. That was roughly the time that Beowulf was written down. But Beowulf was clearly based on earlier folk tales. But that was the first time someone wrote down a dragon that breathed fire, the one that Beowulf fought. And so that became an attribute of some, but not all dragons after that. Because shortly after that was written down, Christianity came along. Now, in Christianity, snakes are evil.
Right.
Going back to the Garden of Eden, snakes literally are evil. It was a snake that tempted Eve and caused the downfall of mankind, the destruction of paradise. In the Bible and reinterpretations of the Old Testament, the snake is referred to as actually Satan or the devil, although in the actual book of Genesis, he's never referred to that way at all. Plus, I thought it struck me as kind of amusing that after the whole Eve and the apple thing, God punishes the serpent by removing his limbs so he has to crawl on the ground. So I asked myself, what did the snake look like before God cursed him? So in Christian theology, snakes had arms and legs at one point, but no longer. So not surprisingly, they considered the dragon to be like a snake. Snakes represented Satan, and dragons were just another form of snakes in their mythology. So the dragon became the symbol of Satan and basically of human weakness and all like worldly ill. So right away, killing a dragon was something that knights were expected to do. Killing a dragon was symbolic of you're really killing the sinful part of yourself, or you're really purging evil from the land, or whatever. You're curing a plague by killing a dragon, because the dragon symbolizes illness and that kind of thing. It was all an allegory. If you ever wondered where like half of our myths about dragons come from, it's from the Middle Ages and this Christian theology. Because dragons were evil, they had to represent evil things, mostly the 7 deadly sins. You think of a dragon sleeping on a huge hoard of gold. Well, greed is one of the 7 deadly sins. Adventurers who creep into a dragon's cave often find him sleeping, because sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins. Why are dragons interested in virgins? Lust is one of the 7 deadly sins. So literally, this church was drilling home into people's heads how evil they were by associating them entirely with like the most evil things that they knew of. So Christianity did a very good job in making dragons like pure evil. Although interestingly, I noticed doing a quick like Google search, St. George is the most famous dragon slayer in history. St. George and the Dragon was the topic for literally hundreds of pictures. Stained glass windows and paintings on walls and portraits going across a period of a couple of 100 years. St. George and the Dragon was really super popular. And so you got these different depictions of dragons. In the early ones from like the 1300s and 1400s, St. George has his big lance and he's dressed like a knight and he's attacking a monster that's mostly a snake. It's a snake with small legs that's winding around his lance in several of the different versions. But as time goes on, you get closer to the Renaissance, like the 1600s and 1700s, the same image of St. George and the dragon now no longer has the long serpentine neck. He has a more of a squat, powerful body, like he's a really big, strong, dangerous creature. So he's becoming less and less snake, and more the four-legged dragon that became the typical dragon of Western culture. And it happened gradually over a period of time. So even though the church tried to tarnish dragons completely, they failed. Because many people still like the dragons. Let's face it, dragons are kind of cool. Even when all this was going on, there was still another thread going on that looked up to and admired dragons for their tremendous strength and power that they possessed. For instance, Camelot, King Arthur. Arthur's father was Uther Pendragon, and the dragon was literally his symbol. Merlin's origin story is tied to a story of a dragon. When Arthur was a Christian knight who was responsible for slaying several dragons in his career, but he rode into battle with a banner that had his father's image on it, which was the dragon. So the dragon is symbolic both of evil and of a goodly knight like King Arthur. There's a dragon on the flag of Wales. And it's been there for a very long time. People also in the Middle Ages invented the idea of heraldry. You wanted like a crest to symbolize your family. Right. As you want something powerful on your crest to symbolize how awesome your family is. And what's more powerful than dragons?
True.
But not everybody could have a dragon on their crest. And there was such demand that they started to like subdivide dragons into different categories. So
you're only this cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And no, there's a whole science of whether the dragon is rearing up on his hind legs, whether he has all 4 feet on the ground, and dragon supine who's lying down is a whole different thing. I'm not going to get into heraldry, but people who wanted to be cool but weren't like noble enough to have a dragon would wind up with different versions of dragons. So England gave us the worm, which is a long serpentine body and no legs whatsoever. It is like a giant snake, but it has the massive head and the jaws. It doesn't have like fangs like a snake does. It's not a snake, it's a dragon, because it has a big head, and that's the worm. And the worms are part of British folk tales in several different places, the Lindorm worm and that kind of thing. So there's folk tales about what they call giant worms, and they don't mean worms like earthworms. They mean it's a legless dragon.
So that's entirely new to me. I completely would have associated that with Asia.
No, and these also were often associated with water. They hid in wells in several of the stories.
Oh, are you talking about Nessie?
Not exactly. Nessie at least has flippers, but it does have a long neck usually. So they invented the worm. You could have a worm on your family crest. They also had the drake. And the drake basically had a creature with scales, 4 legs, and no wings. It still had the head of a dragon. But it didn't have the serpentine body. It was more like a Komodo dragon, except it didn't drag its belly on the ground. It had longer legs.
At least that one I've heard of before. Yeah. It rings a bell.
Yeah, the drake is basically like a serpentine wolf sort of thing. But the most popular one wasn't either of those. The popular one was the wyvern.
The what?
The wyvern. Okay. It's spelled W-Y-V-E-R-N.
All right.
Now, the wyvern is kind of cool because they have hind legs with claws and a long tail with a point on the end of it, which is sometimes poisoned. And instead of front legs, they have wings. Literally, the wings are their front legs. So they rear up and then they spread their wings and they balance on their hind legs and their long tail.
Cool.
They were very cool. The wyvern is all over heraldry. A lot of like sports teams, colleges, and things like that have the wyvern as their symbol, because the wyvern, despite being clearly in the dragon family, wasn't condemned by the church. It was just a cool monster.
All right.
There are no stories about knights killing wyverns, so it was okay to have a wyvern. Nobody would come after you.
It wasn't political.
Yeah. So interestingly, I thought this was very funny. This is a fact I learned during research. Have you seen the Hobbit movies? I don't recommend them. The Hobbit movies are not very good. But J.R.R. Tolkien created one of the most famous dragons in fiction in Smaug. Smaug pretty much is the personification of all the European dragon myths stuffed into one creature.
Okay, so pause.
Yep.
I'm trying so hard. The Hobbit movies, are we talking about the Ring?
Lord of the Rings takes place after The Hobbit. It's several years later.
So different movie.
They're different movies. A set of movies called The Hobbit, based on the book that Tolkien wrote. It's the prequel to Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
It takes place years before the events of Lord of the Rings. It does show how the magic ring came into Bilbo's possession and everything, though.
I haven't seen those.
Okay, you don't have to because they're not very good.
Okay.
They're not very good at all. And they're way too long. But the amusing part about all this is is that when we see Smaug the dragon in the first Hobbit movie, it's mostly in a brief appearance, which is all CG, of course. But we see him walking in all four legs, destroying a town. But in the second Hobbit movie, and there are like 5 of them, I think. In the second Hobbit movie, and this time he was motion captured from Benedict Cumberbatch, who provided the voice. And in that one, he has no front legs. He said has wings. And they said the reason they did that was they changed the design of Smaug completely between films because Cumberbatch actually got like down on the floor and was acting out the role of Smaug. And when he moved, he walked on his wings, kind of pulling his body forward. Now, that's the way that we imagine that pterodactyls walked.
Huh.
See? Dinosaurs again.
Yeah.
Pterodactyls couldn't really walk all that well, but scientists believe they could throw themselves forward and walk on their wingtips. And Cumberbatch, for whatever reason, imagined Smaug walking like that. So he abandoned the idea of having front legs and walked on his wings when he moved as Smaug.
Interesting.
It led many purists to sniff and go, he's not a true dragon, he's a wyvern. But the fact is, in some ways, that makes Smaug, or wyverns in general, more realistic.
Okay.
So the reason I'm saying realistic is that all the land animals that have limbs evolved from a fish that had 4 fins. And that became the arms, the legs, or the wings of every land animal that we have today. Mm-hmm. So every land animal that has limbs has 4 of them.
Okay.
No more, no less. Anything that has more legs isn't a bony land animal. Mm-hmm. Now, a dragon generally has 4 legs and wings, giving him 6 limbs. And so in a lot of ways, artists trying to draw dragons find that it looks wrong, because instinctively they know creatures are supposed to have 4 limbs. Obviously, artists can overcome that reluctance. There's been many gorgeous pictures of 4-legged dragons with beautiful sets of wings. But symmetrically, turning the front legs into wings, it lets you to change the proportion of the dragon. It does make him technically into a wyvern. But it also allows you to adjust their anatomy to make them look really, really cool. So there's been a trend in recent fiction to do dragons that don't have front legs.
Listen, I refuse to let you take this from me. I'm sticking to my guns, and I'm saying it's a possibility that they were real.
Yeah.
In the way that I see them.
Yeah. Do you think dragons were real at one point?
I hope so. I do. I can only say that I hope so. Because just what fantastic creatures, you know?
They are amazing. And despite the fact people are technically drawing and creating wyverns these days, they still call them dragons. Because the word dragon carries so much weight. You've got 1,000 years of myth and history on your back when you say the word dragon. The word dragon is magical. And I think you agree with me that dragon is a category rather than a specific monster.
Yes.
So dragon covers a lot of things. Someone said online, it's like saying fairy. Fairy is an umbrella that covers a lot of different creatures. A dragon also covers a lot of different creatures. So we can't consider wyverns to be dragons.
Right.
Good. So ultimately, dragons have evolved from monsters and gods to the symbol of evil. And these days, if you write about dragons, they're often heroes. They're often benevolent. There's lots of stories about shape-shifting dragons. I have the Jennifer Scales series by Davidson in my young adult department about a teenage girl who discovers, when she reaches that certain age, she suddenly grows scales and wings because her mom is actually a dragon shifter. Mm-hmm. And her dad is a dragon hunter. Go figure. Yeah, one of those Romeo and Juliet things.
Not even a little surprised.
Yeah. They figure a lot in paranormal romances. Dragons are sexy. There's a role-playing game called Fireborn that wasn't that popular, but you play a dragon in there, someone who discovers their draconic heritage. The Dungeons & Dragons game, which actually has dragons right in the title, Being Dungeons and Dragons, they've categorized like 20 different types of dragons. I have the Draconomicon there, which goes to the list of all the popular dragons that they have, and lists what each one can and can't do. They don't all have flaming breath. Some of them have poison vapor, and some of them have freezing breath, the frost dragons. So, and they break them down by color. They have the metallic dragons, the dragons that are named after colors, and so forth. Very, very complicated. I happen to bring out, because of its nice cover, the Dracopedia, which is a art book about how to draw dragons. But rather than just doing it as a guy in his studio, the guy who wrote the book talks about dragons as if you could actually go in the wild and find them. And he goes the best places to locate dragons and how you have to approach them and how to get them to stand still while you draw them and things like that. It's really a great book. Dragons are everywhere. They're such a part of popular culture. They're maybe more popular than unicorns. I don't know.
I think so.
Yeah, I think dragons are more popular than unicorns. Although
and probably by far, right? Probably by far.
Probably. Although in My Little Pony, they split the difference and had unicorns and a dragon.
Okay.
So you can't go wrong with putting a dragon into something. All right. So what do you think in total?
I like dragons.
Yeah, dragons are very cool. It's hard to say exactly what the appeal is.
That is food for thought.
When I was a kid, I leaned into dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are like dragons, but I knew they were real at one point. So I could really love dinosaurs as a kid and not have to worry about magic and wizards and all that stuff.
I think for me personally, it's just the power, power.
The raw power. One of the reasons why they're popular is they symbolize so much to so many different people. Dragons are sexy if you want to look at them that way. They always represent strength, and they can represent magical strength. The dragons of the Orient were strong physically, but they were also spellcasters. And they control the weather, so they could make your crops grow and things like that. So they control all kinds of magical elements. They're always associated with water rather than fire in the East. All the Asian dragons are water dragons of various sorts. Each of the oceans had a dragon, and every major body of water had its own dragon in those days. So you can look and find a dragon myth that symbolizes how you feel about them without any trouble whatsoever.
Very cool.
Yep. Any final thoughts?
Just that I will have my eyes and ears open for dragons, if nothing else but to prove your theory wrong.
All right. You don't have to buy my theory. All right. Until next time, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you again. Till then, be safe.